Brick Aramella, the Drone Pilot Pro here, and today I'm going to compare the Mavic Air 2 versus the DJI Mavic 2 Pro in a high ISO comparisons. So a lot of people aren't really aware of ISO, or they leave it on auto. And my recommendation is you don't leave it on auto. Instead, change it to as low as possible. With these drones, it's 100. So 100 is a good starting place, and then you could raise it up if it's too dark, if the image is too dark. Now, what is ISO? Well, ISO, the lower it is, the sharper, basically the sharper your image will be, and then the higher it goes, the more noise or digital noise will be in your image. So with film cameras, they used to call it grain, and the image was kind of like, it almost looked a little blurry, kind of degraded the image the higher up you went. But some people kind of like that kind of grainy look. But with digital, to me, it just doesn't look as good as it did with film. So they call it digital noise. And my recommendation is to keep the noise as low as possible. So whenever you raise the ISO, yes, the sensor is going to be more sensitive. So more light's going to enter and hit that sensor. So the image is going to look brighter. However, you're really degrading the image. You're making it a little more, adding that noise in, and it kind of looks a little blurry or degraded, and that's not what we want. That's why we want to keep our ISO as low as possible. All right, so before we get to the test, I'm going to show you how to adjust your ISO, both in the DJI Fly app and the DJI Go 4 app for these two drones. So let's go do that now. All right, so I'm going to start by going into the DJI Fly app right here. Now in the DJI Fly app, as you can see, the drone is just facing me. It's dark here. And we're just gonna put normal 4K here. Now ISO applies for both photos and video. So we can see the ISO as we go up. We just click down here in the lower right here corner, and we can raise it up. It's really dark. We can't really see much right now. That's about as much as we can see with video. Now if I change it to photo, we'll be able to see a little more. Okay, let's just change it to photo. And with photo, we can change our shutter speed, and then we raise our ISO. You can see the different ISOs, 200, we go to 400, that should be good. Okay, it's a little dark, 800, there we go. And you can see all that digital noise. All right, so that's how you change the ISO in the DJI Fly app. Now let's go to the DJI Go 4 app. All right, so now we got our Mavic 2 Pro controller hooked up to our iPad. So we're gonna go into the DJI Go 4 app. Okay, so now in the app, we're gonna go over here. We're gonna change it to photo, and we'll look at the settings. We'll press in that M right there, and we can see it's on 1600. We could change our aperture, moving our aperture to 2.8. That'll let more light in. And now we can just adjust the ISO, okay? I think 800 is pretty good. Leave it right there. And that's how you adjust your ISO in the DJI Go 4 app. All right guys, now I have my laptop right here. So I'm gonna take a look on my laptop, and we're gonna get into this comparison. We're gonna look at all the footage side by side, and I'm gonna give you my opinion and recommendations for what you should use for high ISOs and different ISOs with these two different DJI drones. All right, so looking at it, the first thing, we have the Mavic Air 2, and we start with the lowest ISO possible. Remember, we always want to keep our ISO as low as possible, so we'll have the sharpest image. All right, so to start this comparison, I just shot video, so we're gonna go through video first, and then we're gonna go through still images. Okay, so I shot at ISO 100, 24 frames per second at 1/50th of a second, and with the Mavic 2 Pro, I use an f-stop of f4.5. You can't change the aperture with the Mavic Air 2, so that's why you don't see it right here. But looking side by side, they both look great. ISO 100, you're not gonna see a huge difference. Now, I could have added sharpness to the Mavic 2 Pro, but the Mavic Air 2 has that sharpness already in camera, and to me, it's a little over sharpened, but that's personal preference. Especially with these trees, you're gonna see little artifacting and so forth, but it's not too noticeable. So they both look great in my opinion. And you can see how similar they look. They have different sensors, but at ISO 100, you're not gonna see too much of a difference for video anyway. Now we bump it up to ISO 400. So ISO 400, I skipped 200, went straight up to 400. Actually, ISO 400, they both look really good. I'm actually surprised at how good the Mavic Air 2 looks. even on the corners, the Mavic Air 2 actually looks a little better than the Mavic 2 Pro. The Mavic 2 Pro looks a little soft in the corners. The colors I like a little better with the Mavic 2 Pro, but again, we're comparing the digital noise here, and the digital noise, they both look very good at ISO 400. Of course, the scene is pretty well lit. We're not in really low light here. Same sort of settings from the previous shot, so at 400, you're not going to see a whole lot of difference. The Mavic 2 Pro, to my eye, I like the colors better, but in terms of the actual noise in the image, there's not much difference. So they're both very good, and I'm actually surprised at how good the Mavic Air 2 is, considering it has a smaller camera sensor than the Mavic 2 Pro. So let's move on to the next one. The next one I shot at ISO 800. So here we should start to see a little bit of a difference. I used an auto white balance, and it seems to be quite different the way it's auto white balancing, and you can obviously there's some differences in the color of characteristics of the camera sensor, but from this test I'm actually shocked. The Mavic Air 2 looks great. It might actually even look a little better than the Mavic 2 Pro. Now I could add a little sharpening. I think that's why it's a little soft right now, but the corners, it is a problem with the Mavic 2 Pro. The corners around the edges, it tends to get a little soft, and it's more noticeable at ISO 800. And side by side, it's really close. I don't see any noticeable difference yet. Now for video, if we move it up to 1600, now we're at 1600. This is where the Mavic 2 Pro starts looking better. The Mavic Air 2 just looks, you can just see the noise on the side of the image. You can see on the left side there, it looks really noisy. I don't know why on the left side it got so noisy, but it looks really noisy. And you can see in the Mavic 2 Pro, yeah, it looks noisy on the left side, but not like the Mavic Air 2. Okay, the Mavic Air 2 is just way too noisy, and to me it's not usable at 1600. They're both usable at 800, but the Mavic 2 Pro is still usable at 1600. Not great, but still usable. So there is a significant difference at 1600, but again, we're not going to shoot at 1600 very often, but just so you see it, there is definitely a lot of noise in the Mavic Air 2. And obviously we're going to see that noise because the camera sensor is only 1/2 inches with the Mavic Air 2, whereas the Mavic 2 Pro has a full 1 inch sensor. So difference in size of the camera sensor, we're definitely seeing it with the higher ISO, which is what I expected. So for video, my overall conclusion, keep it to 800 or lower, and really 800 or lower in good light. The Mavic Air 2 or the Mavic 2 Pro are both going to look great, and you're not going to see too much difference. If you go over 800, that's where you're going to see the difference. So now we look at the still images. We're at 100. Again, 100, you're not going to see a ton of difference. I tried different things like HDR. You can see here with the Mavic Air 2, it just gives it a different look. Definitely brings out the sky a lot more. We can see obviously more dynamic range. Use stuff like HDR and hyperlight. Just right out of the bat, just normal, we can see that side by side there isn't a huge difference between the Mavic 2 Pro and the Mavic Air 2 for still images at ISO 100. The Mavic 2 Pro seems just more natural, more just better to my eye, but you know, that's personal preference. You can see with the HDR, you can bring more of the images back. But again, that's only ISO 100. Let's take a look at something higher. So we go to 400 and 400. 400, I'm looking at these for some reason. The Mavic 2 Pro, it does look like there's just more detail. There's a little grain. I can see it ever so slightly on the still image for whatever reason with the Mavic Air 2. But they both, again, I'm picking hairs here. They both look great. Okay, so they both look great at 400. Now, one thing I noticed, the Mavic Air 2 with the smart capture, it seemed to be less noisy, at least in this image. I tend to do everything manual and just use that, but you know, this artificial intelligence, this smart mode for the Mavic Air 2 seems to be really good, and I left everything else on auto. So the Mavic Air 2, when used smart mode, it's definitely sharper. It definitely seems like there's a little less noise. I'm not sure if it just added more contrast and made it sharper, but it does seem like there's less noise. That was right after I took the ISO 400 shot. With the Mavic 2 Pro, I would only use hyperlight if it's really low light. The HDR seems to work well in between ISO 400 700 to 800. You have to get really high up or almost like a nighttime scene to use hyperlight. And I think that's where you'll see the Mavic 2 Pro really outperform the Mavic Air 2. Now at ISO 800, just shooting normally on this with a normal lighting scene, it seems really good for both drones. So again, ISO 800, I might see a little more noise on the Mavic Air 2, but not really too much. They're both still really good. I am noticing, actually when I take a closer look, I am noticing a little more noise on the Mavic Air 2, but it's so small at 400 and 800 that you really can't notice. I'm really picking hairs here, so there's not too much difference. Now if we go to 1600, once again 1600, that's where a noticeable difference, but it doesn't seem as noticeable with photos as it does video. For photos, you might be able to get away with using a lower shutter speed, or just at 1600, the Mavic Air 2 looks pretty darn good, but it is definitely soft and a lot softer than the Mavic 2 Pro. The smart capture actually helps make it a little sharper, so maybe reduce that noise. So all in all, for photography with the Mavic Air 2, try to use a smart capture if you have a high ISO. That tends to add a little contrast, or whatever it does, it tends to look better than just shooting it normal. Other than that, I wouldn't shoot at ISO 1600 with the Mavic Air 2. But from what I can see doing this test, both of these drones are gonna look great from ISO 100 to 800. At 100 and 200, which I didn't have in this test, they basically are indistinguishable. So if you keep it at 200 or less, both these drones are gonna look great, okay? Once you get to 400 and 800, Mavic 2 Pro is gonna look a little better, especially with the images. For video, I didn't notice as much of a difference, but for photos, I noticed a ever so slight difference. And then for 1600, I noticed a big difference between the both of them, and you're definitely gonna wanna go with the Mavic 2 Pro if you shoot at ISO 1600. I'd recommend you don't do that. And even for video, one thing you can do is, sometimes I use a lower shutter speed. So what I do is, instead of shooting 1/50th of a second, if I'm shooting 24 frames per second, sometimes I use 1/40th of a second. I break the rule, or I go down to 1/30th of a second, and it's not really what you want because it adds more of a kind of like a motion blur to your image, but it's not a huge deal. So if that prevents you from going from 800 to 1600, then I would recommend doing that. All right guys, that's it for today. If you enjoyed this video and want free DJI drone training, I made a video and you can click on that in the description below, or you can click on the link right over there. I'm Brick Aramella, the Drone Pilot Pro, and remember, fly like a pro.